There are thresholds in your life that are not made of wood and steel, but of silence. They are not doors you walk through, but moments you survive. For months, my threshold was the 3 feet of space between the edge of my sofa and the coffee table, a narrow channel of worn floorboards that separated my world from his. He was asleep on my couch again, a fortress of cushions and blankets built around him, and I was sitting in the dark, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. This had become our ritual, an unspoken agreement born from his crisis and my quiet, unyielding patience. His name was Caleb, and for the past 10 years, he had been the unshakable pillar of my life. Now, that pillar had crumbled, and he had come to me to rebuild, piece by piece, in the quiet sanctuary of my small apartment. He had arrived one rainy Tuesday night, a ghost at my door, his face pale and his clothes soaked through. He hadn't called. He never needed to. Our friendship was built on an architecture of open doors and assumed welcomes. But this time was different. The usual easy confidence that hung about him like a well-worn coat was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out vulnerability that made my own heart ache in sympathy. He was the pastor's son, the golden child of our small town, a person whose life seemed pre-written in chapters of success and certainty. I was not. I was the boy from the other side of the tracks, the quiet observer with a camera for a shield, the one whose name was sometimes spoken in cautionary whispers in the same circles that praised his. And yet, here he was, seeking refuge in my world, the one everyone had warned him about. He didn't say much that first night. He just stood in my entryway, dripping onto the welcome mat, and mumbled something about Sarah, his girlfriend of 5 years, the girl everyone had assumed he would marry. I didn't need the details. I could see the entire story in the fault lines around his eyes. I took his wet jacket, made him a cup of tea he didn't drink, and offered him the couch. He accepted with a nod, his gratitude a heavy, unspoken thing between us. I watched him settle in, pulling the old quilt I kept on the armchair over his long frame. He was asleep in minutes, a sleep so deep and immediate it was more like a collapse, an utter surrender to exhaustion. I stayed up for hours, watching him, a sentinel guarding a kingdom of one. My world had shrunk to the dimensions of my living room, to the sound of his breathing, to the faint, familiar scent of his soap and the damp wool of his sweater. And in that compressed space, a dangerous, long-dormant hope began to stir within me, a fragile green shoot pushing its way through the compacted soil of my carefully managed heart. To understand the weight of that silence, the sheer gravitational pull of his presence on my couch, you have to understand the foundation on which our friendship was built. We met in high school, a collision of two completely different worlds. Caleb was everything I was not. He was the star of the soccer team. His laughter was loud and easy, and he moved through the crowded hallways with an unconscious grace that drew people into his orbit. He was beloved, not just for his athletic prowess or his family standing, but for a genuine kindness that seemed to radiate from him, a warmth that felt like standing in a patch of sunlight on a cold day. I, on the other hand, had perfected the art of invisibility. I was the quiet one, the artsy kid who always had a sketchbook or a camera in hand, using the lens as a barrier between myself and a world that often felt too loud, too bright, too demanding. I observed life. I didn't participate in it. Our friendship began over a shared project in a history class we both loathed. We were assigned to be partners, a random pairing that felt like a cosmic joke to me. I was prepared for him to do the bare minimum, to let me handle the research and the writing while he focused on more important things, like practice and popularity. But he surprised me. He showed up. He came to the library after school, his gym bag slung over his shoulder, smelling of cut grass and effort. He was genuinely curious, asking thoughtful questions, listening to my ideas with an intensity that made me feel, for the first time in a long time, seen. He didn't treat me like the weird, quiet kid. He treated me like an equal. He saw the world I captured through my camera lens and didn't just see pictures. He saw stories. He saw the way I framed a shot, the way I found beauty in the forgotten and the overlooked, and he told me it was a gift. That was the beginning. Our study sessions bled into conversations about everything and nothing. We discovered a shared love for old movies, for the specific kind of melancholy that settles in on a Sunday afternoon. I learned that beneath the golden boy exterior was a person with his own quiet anxieties, his own pressures. The weight of being the pastor's son was heavier than anyone knew. He felt the constant, suffocating pressure of expectation, the need to be a perfect example, a role model. With me, he confessed, he didn't have to perform. He could just be. He could be tired, or unsure, or frustrated. I became his confidant, his safe harbor, the one place where the carefully constructed facade of Caleb Hale could be set aside. And in that shared vulnerability, a bond formed, deep and resilient, a friendship that baffled everyone who knew us. For my part, I fell in love with him so slowly and quietly that I barely noticed it happening. It wasn't a sudden crash of lightning, but more like the gradual turning of a season, an imperceptible shift in the quality of the light. It was in the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners when he genuinely smiled, a smile that was different from the one he gave everyone else. It was in the way he'd unconsciously lean into my space when we talked, a casual proximity that always sent a jolt through my system. It was in the fierce loyalty he showed me, defending me from the casual cruelties of our peers without a second thought. I loved him for the person he was when the world wasn't looking. And I buried that love so deep inside myself it became a part of my own internal architecture, a hidden room with no doors, a place I never intended for anyone, especially him, to find. It was a secret I kept with the same diligence that a photographer protects an undeveloped roll of film, knowing that exposing it to the light too soon, or in the wrong way, would destroy the image forever. So I became the perfect friend, the steady, reliable presence in his life, and I told myself it was enough. It had to be. For years, it was. We navigated the end of high school, the confusing maze of college applications, and the eventual divergence of our paths. He went to a large university a few hours away to study software engineering and play soccer, while I attended a local art school, refining my eye and my craft in the quiet solitude of the darkroom. We never lost touch. Our friendship adapted, stretching across the distance through late-night phone calls and weekend visits. He would tell me about his classes, his teammates, and about Sarah. She was perfect for him, in that storybook way. Pretty, kind, from a good family. She was the girl everyone expected him to be with. And I was happy for him. Truly. I listened, I offered advice, I was the supportive friend. Each mention of her name was a small, sharp pinprick to that hidden room inside me, but I learned to ignore the sting. His happiness was paramount. As long as he was happy, I could survive the quiet ache of my own unrequited feelings. Then, life after college began. I found a small, sun-drenched apartment in the city and started a fledgling career as a freelance photographer. Caleb, now a sought-after software consultant, moved into a sleek, modern condo with Sarah. Our lives were separate, but still deeply intertwined. We fell into a comfortable routine. Every few weeks, he would come over, ostensibly to escape the pressures of his high-stakes job, but I knew it was more than that. My apartment, with its mismatched furniture, walls covered in my photographs, and the constant smell of developing chemicals, was a different world from his clean, minimalist life. It was a place of quiet creation, of introspection. It was the one place he could still just be. We would order takeout, watch old movies, and talk for hours. He would stretch out on my worn-out sofa, his long legs dangling over the armrest, and the familiar, comfortable peace of our friendship would settle over the room. Those nights were the bedrock of my life, the moments I held on to, proof that some things, at least, were constant. And then came the rain, and the ghost at my door, and the end of his world with Sarah. The shift was seismic. It was not just a breakup. It was the derailment of a future that had been meticulously planned since he was a teenager. The wedding, the house in the suburbs, the 2.5 children, it all evaporated overnight. He never explained exactly what happened, and I never asked. All I knew was that he was adrift, cut loose from the moorings that had defined his life for so long. He had his family, of course, his father the pastor, his ever-supportive mother. But I understood, without him having to say it, why he couldn't go to them. Their comfort would come with a side of scripture, of gentle but firm guidance back to the path they had laid out for him. They would see his pain as a spiritual crisis to be managed. I just saw his pain. I didn't offer solutions or platitudes. I offered silence. I offered tea. I offered my couch. That first night bled into a second, and then a third. It became the new ritual. He would finish work, drive to my apartment instead of his empty condo, and we would fall into a pattern of quiet companionship. Sometimes we talked, his voice low and ragged as he picked at the edges of his grief. More often, we existed in a shared silence, the television murmuring in the background, the space between us filled with a weight of unspoken things. He started leaving a change of clothes at my place, a toothbrush in the cup by the sink. My small, one-bedroom apartment began to feel less like my own and more like ours. I was living in a state of suspended reality, a fragile bubble of domesticity that I knew could pop at any moment. Every morning, I would wake up on my lumpy mattress on the floor of my bedroom. I had insisted he take the bed after the third night, but he refused, claiming the sofa was fine, and the first thing I would do was listen for the sound of his breathing from the other room. It was the metronome that set the rhythm of my days. I became a student of his grief, of his exhaustion. I learned the cartography of his weariness. I could see it in the slump of his shoulders, in the way he rubbed his eyes, in the hollows that had appeared beneath his cheekbones. He was a ship taking on water, and I was frantically bailing, using whatever I had, bad movies, takeout pizza, a steady presence, to keep him afloat. I photographed him, of course. Not overtly, not with a pose session, but I captured him in stolen moments. Caleb asleep on the couch, the morning light tracing the line of his jaw. Caleb staring out the window, his reflection a ghostly double in the glass. Caleb with his head in his hands at my kitchen table. I was documenting his unraveling, but in the process, I was also seeing him more clearly than ever before. The golden boy was gone, and in his place was someone more complex, more fragile, more human. And my love for him, that secret, buried thing, deepened and intensified until it was a constant, low-grade fever in my blood. I was terrified. The first time he touched me, it was an accident. Or at least, I told myself it was. We were on the couch, watching some black-and-white film noir. It was late, and the city outside my window had fallen into a deep hush. He had been quiet for a long time, and I thought he had fallen asleep. He was stretched out, his head propped on the armrest, and I was curled in the opposite corner, maintaining the customary, safe distance between us. Then, in his sleep, he shifted. He rolled onto his side, facing me, and his arm flopped out, landing across my lap. It was a dead weight, heavy and warm. My entire body went rigid. I held my breath, waiting for him to wake up, to realize what he'd done, to pull away with an awkward apology. But he didn't. His breathing remained deep and even. His hand, resting on my thigh, was relaxed, his fingers slightly curled. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, every nerve in my body hyper-aware of the point of contact. The warmth of his arms seeped through the denim of my jeans, a radiating heat that seemed to travel up my spine. I could feel the faint, steady rhythm of his pulse against my leg. It was the most intimate, terrifying, and profoundly beautiful thing I had ever experienced. My mind raced, trying to categorize the moment, to file it away as something meaningless, a simple, unconscious act of a sleeping man. But my heart, that traitorous organ, was having none of it. It was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the quiet room. I didn't dare move. I didn't want the moment to end. I sat there, a statue carved from anxiety and longing, until my own legs went numb, just so I could feel the weight of him against me for a little longer. When the movie ended and the screen went black, I finally, carefully, lifted his arm and gently placed it back on his chest. He stirred but didn't wake. I escaped to my bedroom, my heart in my throat, and I knew, with a dreadful certainty, that the carefully constructed walls around my feelings were beginning to crumble. The foundation was cracking. The couch ritual continued, but something had subtly changed. The invisible boundary between us had become more permeable. He would sit a little closer, his knee occasionally brushing against mine. He stopped building the fortress of pillows between himself and the rest of the room. One evening, about a month into his self-imposed exile at my apartment, he was particularly quiet. The day had clearly been a hard one. He had spent most of the evening staring at his phone, his brow furrowed. I didn't pry. I just let the silence be. We were washing the dishes from dinner, or rather, I was washing and he was standing nearby, drying them with a dish towel. When he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "My dad called today," he said, not looking at me. "He wants to know when I'm coming back to church. When I'm going to get my life back on track." I rinsed a plate and handed it to him, my movements slow and deliberate. "What did you say?" He shrugged, a gesture of profound weariness. "The usual. That I'm busy with work. That I'm fine. The same lies I've been telling for weeks." He placed the dry plate on the counter with a soft clink. "He and Sarah's mom had coffee. He thinks this is just a test. A phase. That will work it out. That I'll come to my senses." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "My senses? I don't even know what those are anymore." He fell silent, his back still to me. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the rigid line of his spine. I finished the last of the dishes, turned off the water, and dried my hands. I wanted to say something comforting, something wise, but all the words felt hollow. So I just stood there, a few feet behind him, a silent witness to his quiet struggle. After a long moment, he turned around. His eyes were shadowed, filled with a confusion so deep it looked like pain. "I hate my condo," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "It's so empty, so quiet. It feels like a museum of a life I was supposed to have. Everything in there," Sarah picked it out. "The furniture, the art, the color of the walls. It doesn't feel like mine." It never did. He looked around my cluttered, chaotic apartment, at the stacks of books and the prints leaning against the wall. This place feels real." My heart did a slow, painful somersault in my chest. "You can stay as long as you need to, Caleb. You know that." He nodded, and then he did something that completely unmoored me. He took a step forward, closing the small space between us, and wrapped his arms around me. It wasn't a quick, friendly hug. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, his arms tightening around my back, and he just held on. I could feel the slight tremble that ran through his body. I stood frozen for a second, my own arms hovering uselessly at my sides, before I finally, tentatively, brought them up to rest on his back. I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin, smell the faint scent of his shampoo. He felt solid and real and incredibly fragile all at once. We stood there for a long time, locked in that silent, desperate embrace in the middle of my small kitchen. It wasn't romantic. It was something more elemental than that. It was two people holding on in the dark, trying to keep from drifting away. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were glistening, but he didn't say a word. He just gave me a small, grateful nod and retreated to the couch, pulling the quilt up to his chin. That night, the 3 feet of space between the couch and the coffee table felt less like a boundary and more like a sacred, charged territory that we had, together, just crossed. The unspoken rules of our arrangement continued to dissolve, slowly, like sugar in hot water. The accidental touches became less accidental. He would fall asleep with his head on my shoulder while we watched a movie, and I would let him, my own body aching with the stillness required not to wake him. The couch, once a symbol of his temporary status, started to feel like a permanent fixture of our shared life. But it was still the couch. A barrier. A clear demarcation. This is my home, and you are a guest in it. My bed, behind the closed door of my room, was my own private island, the one piece of territory that remained unequivocally mine. That changed on a cold night in late autumn. A sudden cold snap had descended on the city, and my apartment's ancient heating system was no match for it. I had piled every blanket I owned onto Caleb's makeshift bed on the couch, but when I woke up in the middle of the night, a deep, penetrating chill had settled into the room. I got up, my bare feet freezing on the floorboards, and went into the living room. He was shivering in his sleep, curled into a tight ball, his breath misting in the frigid air. My mind went to war with itself. The logical part, the friend part, told me what I should do. Offer him my bed. It was warmer in my room, slightly more insulated from the drafty windows. It was the decent, human thing to do. But the other part of me, the part that had been living on scraps of affection and misinterpreted gestures, was screaming in terror. My bed was not neutral territory. It was the heart of my solitude, the place where I dreamed, the most intimate space I possessed. To invite him in there felt like a monumental risk, a line I wasn't sure I could uncross. I stood there for a long time, a silhouette in the dim light filtering in from the street, watching him shiver. And in the end, the simple, undeniable fact of his discomfort won out over my own complex fears. I couldn't let him be cold. I walked over and gently touched his shoulder. "Caleb," I whispered. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open, clouded with sleep. "Hey, it's freezing out here. You should take my bed." "It's warmer," he blinked, trying to process my words. "No, man, I'm fine. You don't have to. I'm not going to let you freeze on my couch," I said, my voice firmer than I intended. "Come on. Just for tonight." He hesitated for a moment, then nodded, too tired and too cold to argue. He unfolded himself from the couch, grabbing the quilt, and followed me into my bedroom. The room felt impossibly small with him in it. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. I gestured towards the bed. "I'll take the couch," I said, already turning to leave. "Wait," he said, his voice thick with sleep. I stopped, my hand on the doorknob. "The bed's big enough. Don't be stupid. You'll freeze out there." It was not a proposition. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same casual logic he might use to solve a coding problem. The bed was a queen. We were two people. It was cold. The solution was simple. But for me, it was the most complicated equation I had ever faced. Every instinct screamed at me to refuse, to retreat to the safety of the living room. But I looked at his exhausted face, the plea for simple warmth and comfort in his eyes, and I found myself nodding. I got into the bed on the far side, keeping as much distance between us as possible, my back to him. The mattress dipped with his weight as he settled in behind me. The silence in the room was absolute, a living, breathing entity. I lay there, rigid, my muscles coiled tight, my entire being focused on the space between our bodies. I was acutely aware of his breathing, of the warmth radiating from him across the small expanse of cotton sheet. I was certain I wouldn't sleep a wink. I would just lie there, suspended in this state of heightened awareness, until morning. But then, after about 10 minutes of this agonizing stillness, he shifted. He rolled onto his side, facing my back. And then, I felt it. A hesitant touch, then the solid, grounding weight of his arm draping over my waist. He pulled himself closer, until his chest was flush against my back, his legs tangled with mine. He sighed, a soft, warm breath against the back of my neck, and his whole body seemed to relax, to melt into a state of deep sleep. He had bridged the gap. He had closed the distance. And I was left there, in the dark, with his arm around me, his body a warm, solid line against mine, my heart threatening to beat its way out of my chest. This was no longer an accident. This was not an unconscious gesture in his sleep. This was a choice. But what it meant, I had no idea. I only knew that for the first time in months, despite the storm of confusion and fear raging inside me, I felt profoundly, terrifyingly safe. And I did not move until the sun came up. That night established the final, most intimate, and most dangerous phase of our ritual. The pretense of the couch was abandoned. Every night, he would come to my apartment, and we would end up in my bed. It was a silent, mutual agreement. We never spoke of it. In the morning, we would move around each other with a careful, deliberate casualness, making coffee, talking about the day ahead, studiously ignoring the fact that we had spent the night wrapped around each other like vines. The plausible deniability was a thin, fragile shield we both held up, a way to protect ourselves from the implications of what we were doing. For him, I suspected, it was a way to receive the physical comfort he so desperately craved without having to name it, without having to confront what it might mean about him, about us. For me, it was a form of self-preservation. If I didn't ask what it meant, Then I wouldn't have to hear an answer I didn't want to hear. I wouldn't have to hear him say, "It's just for comfort." It doesn't mean anything, so I lived in the ambiguity. I existed in the space between friendship and something more, a liminal state that was both exquisite and agonizing. I learned the rhythms of his sleeping body as well as I knew my own. I learned that he sometimes mumbled in his sleep, fragments of code or half-formed questions. I learned that he always kicked off the covers, and I would inevitably wake up in the cold to pull them back over us. I learned the exact spot on his back that, when I rested my hand there, would make him sigh in his sleep and press closer to me. My senses were overwhelmed with him. The smell of his skin, a clean, warm scent that was uniquely Caleb. The feel of his hair, soft and thick beneath my fingers when I would get brave in the pre-dawn darkness. The sound of his heartbeat, a slow, steady drum against my back or my chest. I was drowning in him, and I was terrified he was just learning how to swim. My photography became my only outlet, the only place I could process the overwhelming influx of feeling. My work shifted. I had always been drawn to landscapes, to still lives, to the quiet, empty spaces. Now, all I wanted to capture was the human form. I became obsessed with the way light fell on skin, the story told by the curve of a spine, the vulnerability in a sleeping face. My apartment was filled with images of him, not just the sad, documentary-style shots from when he first arrived, but newer ones. Images that were softer, more intimate. A close-up of his hand resting on a pillow. The line of his shoulders as he stood looking out the window. A shot of the rumpled sheets of my bed in the morning, a ghost image of the space where we had lain. I was creating a visual dictionary of my love for him, a language that I couldn't speak aloud. One Saturday, he found me in my darkroom. I usually kept the door locked when I was working, but I'd forgotten this time. He pushed the door open, letting a sliver of light into the red-tinged darkness. "Hey," he said, his voice soft. "Just seeing what you were up to." I was standing over a tray of developer, watching an image of him slowly emerge on the paper. It was one of my favorites, a shot I had taken a few days prior. He was asleep, on his side, his face half buried in the pillow, the morning light catching the stray hairs on his arm. It was a profoundly intimate photo, tender and unguarded. My heart seized with panic. I quickly slid the print into the stop bath, my hands fumbling. "Just finishing up a few things," I said, trying to sound casual, my back to him. But he had already seen it. He came further into the small, cramped room, his presence filling the space. He looked at the other prints I had hung up to dry, a clothesline of my secret affection. There were at least a dozen images of him, in various states of repose and reflection. He was silent for a long time, just looking. The only sounds were the gentle sloshing of the chemicals and the frantic thumping of my own heart. I braced myself for the question, for the accusation, for the inevitable awkward conversation where I would have to explain away my obsession. But when he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a strange sort of wonder. "You see me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I feel like, for my whole life, people have looked at me, but they've only ever seen the pastor's son, or the soccer captain, or Sarah's boyfriend. They see the idea of me. But you." He reached out and gently touched the corner of one of the prints. "You actually see me." He turned to look at me then, and the expression in his eyes was one I had never seen before. It was raw and open, and filled with a dawning recognition that mirrored the terror and hope that were warring inside me. He saw the photos, and he didn't see a creepy obsession. He saw the truth of my gaze. He saw affection. He saw care. He saw love. And he didn't run. In that small, dark room, surrounded by the evidence of my heart, the final wall between us seemed to dissolve into dust. The air grew thick, charged with years of unspoken words, with months of ambiguous touches. He took a step closer to me, his eyes never leaving mine. The red safe light cast his face in dramatic shadows, highlighting the earnest, searching look in his eyes. And I knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, that we were standing on the edge of a precipice. The ritual was about to end. Something new was about to begin. The moment stretched, taut and fragile. The air in the darkroom was heavy with the scent of chemicals, and something else, something unnameable, that felt like ozone after a lightning strike. He stood so close I could feel the heat coming off his body. His gaze was intense, searching, as if he were trying to read the last 10 years of our history in my face. My own breath was trapped in my lungs, my body a statue of anticipation. This was it. The crossing. The point from which there would be no retreat to the safe, familiar shores of friendship. We were about to set sail into uncharted waters, and I had no idea if we would find a new continent or simply be lost at sea. "Leo," he said, his voice low and raspy. It was the first time he had spoken my name in what felt like hours. The sound of it in the small space was startlingly intimate. I could only manage a nod, my throat tight. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Can I?" He trailed off, his gaze dropping to my lips for a fraction of a second before meeting my eyes again. He didn't finish the question. He didn't have to. The unspoken words hung in the air between us, shimmering with terrifying potential. "Can I kiss you?" It was the question I had dreamed of and feared in equal measure for a decade. And in that moment, all the careful analysis, all the fear of misinterpretation, all the anxiety that had been my constant companion for months, it all fell away. All that was left was the simple, undeniable truth. I wanted him to, more than I had ever wanted anything. I gave another small, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the answer he needed. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away, to stop him. It was a gesture of profound respect, of care. He was not taking, he was asking. I held my ground, my eyes fluttering shut as his face drew nearer. The first touch was hesitant, a soft, tentative press of his lips against mine. It was not a kiss of passion, but of discovery. It was gentle and questioning and achingly tender. It tasted of salt and longing. His hand came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek, and the simple, gentle touch sent a shockwave through my entire system. I brought my own hands up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady, rapid beat of his heart beneath my palms. It was racing just as fast as mine. The kiss deepened, but it never lost its quality of gentleness. It was a conversation without words, a confession of everything we had been unable to say. It was a thank you for the quiet nights, an apology for the confusion, a promise of something new. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. We rested our foreheads together, his hand still on my face, mine still on his chest. The red light of the darkroom seemed to hum around us. "Okay," he breathed out, a single word that held a universe of meaning. It meant, "Okay, this is real. Okay, I'm not running. Okay, this is happening. Okay." I whispered back, my voice shaky. It was my own affirmation. "Okay, I'm terrified, but I'm here. Okay, I'm letting you in." We stood there for a long time, just breathing each other in, our little island of red light a sanctuary from the world outside. The unspoken had finally been spoken, not in words, but in a gesture that was far more honest, far more true. The threshold had been crossed. The door to that hidden room inside me had been thrown wide open, and he had walked in. The only question left was whether he would choose to stay. The morning after was a study in fragile, terrifying newness. Waking up was different. Before, there had always been the shield of ambiguity. We were just two friends, one of whom happened to be sleeping in the other's bed. Now, that shield was gone, shattered into a million pieces. I woke up first, as I always did, but this time, he was already stirring. He was facing me, his eyes still closed, but a soft smile played on his lips. When his eyes did open, they found mine immediately. There was no awkwardness, no regret, just a quiet, sleepy recognition. He reached out and tucked a stray piece of hair behind my ear, his fingers warm against my skin. "Morning," he murmured, his voice still thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my heart doing a nervous flutter. But the quiet peace of the bedroom did not translate to the rest of the apartment. As we moved into the kitchen to make coffee, a subtle tension began to creep in. The casual domesticity that had once felt so natural now seemed charged with meaning. Every glance, every small gesture felt like a question. We were navigating a new landscape without a map. He was quieter than usual, a thoughtful, almost troubled expression on his face as he leaned against the counter, watching me measure out the coffee grounds. The easy silence we had once shared was now filled with the things we still hadn't said. The retreat was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. He left for work that morning with a quick, hesitant kiss at the door that felt more like an afterthought than a confirmation. That evening, he didn't come over. He sent a text. "Gonna be a late one at work. Don't wait up." It was the first night in almost 2 months that he hadn't stayed at my apartment. I told myself it was nothing. He was busy. It was normal. But a cold knot of dread began to form in my stomach. The next day, it was another excuse. A meeting with a client. The day after that, he just didn't text at all. The silence was deafening. My apartment, which had felt like a shared sanctuary for so long, now felt cavernously empty. The indentation his head had left on the pillow on his side of the bed seemed to mock me. The toothbrush in the cup by the sink was a monument to a future that had vanished before it had even begun. I spiraled. I replayed the kiss, the conversation in the darkroom, every moment of the last few months, searching for the clue I had missed. Had I misinterpreted everything? Had the kiss been a moment of grief-fueled confusion for him, a mistake he now deeply regretted? Had I pushed him into something he wasn't ready for? The old insecurities, the ones that told me I was unlovable, that someone like Caleb could never truly choose someone like me, came roaring back. After a week of this agonizing silence, I couldn't take it anymore. The passive observer in me had died. I had risked my heart, and I deserved an answer, even if it was one that would break it. I drove to his condo. I had only been there a handful of times, and it felt like entering a foreign country. It was exactly as he had described it: clean, impersonal, stylish in a way that had no soul. It was a showroom, not a home. He opened the door, and his face was a mask of surprise and something else: guilt. He looked tired, more so than he had even in the depths of his breakup. "Leo," he said, his voice strained. "What are you doing here?" "You disappeared," I said, my voice coming out stronger than I felt. I needed to know why. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure anxiety. "It's complicated, make it simple," I insisted, stepping past him into the condo. "Talk to me, Caleb. After everything, you owe me that." He finally looked at me, and the conflict in his eyes was heartbreaking. It was a battlefield of fear and desire, and a lifetime of expectations. I freaked out. "Okay," he said, his voice cracking. We kissed, and it was the most real thing I've felt in years. And that terrified me. "Why?" I asked, my own fear making my voice sharp. "Why would that scare you?" "Because of everything," he exclaimed, gesturing wildly around the empty room. "Because of my father, my family, my whole life. I'm the pastor's son. I was supposed to marry Sarah, have a family, live in the suburbs. That was the plan. There is no room in that plan for this. For you." The words were brutal, but his expression was one of self-loathing, not malice. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was trying to explain the cage he was in. "So that's it?" I asked, a cold disappointment washing over me. "You feel something real, something that isn't part of the pre-approved script, and you just run away? You throw away what we have because you're scared of what your father will think." "It's not that simple," he shot back, his voice rising. "This isn't just about what he thinks. It's about what I've been taught to believe my entire life. It's about who I'm supposed to be. I don't know how to be that person and also be the person who kisses you in a dark room and wants to do it again." There it was. The confession, tangled up in all the fear and confusion. He wants to do it again. The small, flickering ember of hope inside me flared. I took a deep breath, trying to anchor myself. "I'm not asking you to be someone else, Caleb. I never have. All I've ever seen is you. Not the pastor's son, not the soccer star. Just you. And what happened between us? That was you too. The real you. The one you hide from everyone else. You can't just shove that back in a box because it's inconvenient." My voice broke on the last word. The hurt was too much to hide. I thought my place was a safe harbor for you. But it turns out it was just a temporary stop. A place to hide until you were ready to go back to your real life. I turned to leave, unable to look at him any longer. The pain was a physical thing, a sharp ache in my chest. I had laid my heart bare, and he was telling me it was too complicated, too inconvenient. Leo, wait, he said, his voice desperate. I stopped at the door, but didn't turn around. Please, don't go. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm lost. And I'm scared. And I'm handling this all wrong. I stood there, my back to him, my hand on the doorknob, caught between the instinct to protect myself and the deep, abiding love I still felt for the broken man behind me. The conflict wasn't over. It had just begun, and we were both going to have to decide if we were brave enough to fight it. I turned around slowly. He was standing in the middle of his pristine living room, looking small and lost. The confidence he usually wore so easily was completely gone, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. It was the same vulnerability I had seen the night he first showed up at my door, but this time it was not about Sarah or his future. It was about us. It was about himself. I don't know what to do, Leo, he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. Everything in my head is screaming at me that this is wrong, that I'm wrong. Every sermon I ever heard, every expectation my parents ever had. It's all just a wall. And then there's you. And when I'm with you, none of that seems to matter. The wall just disappears. And then you're gone, and it all comes rushing back in. I walked back towards him, closing the distance between us once more. I stopped a few feet away, giving him space. Then maybe you should stop listening to the voices in your head and start listening to what you feel, I said, my voice softer now. The anger had dissipated, replaced by a deep, aching empathy. What do you feel, Caleb? When you're not thinking about your dad, or Sarah, or the plan. When it's just you, what do you feel? He looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and for a long moment, he didn't speak. He just looked, as if the answer was written somewhere in my face. Then, he finally spoke, the words coming out in a raw, honest rush. I feel calm, for the first time since. I don't even know when. When I was with you, in your apartment, sleeping in your bed, I felt safe. I felt like I could finally breathe. And when we kissed, I felt like I'd come home. He choked on the last word, a single tear finally tracing a path down his cheek. And I'm so terrified of losing that, I ran away from it. It was easier to go back to being miserable in this empty condo than to face how much I need it. How much I need you. The confession hung in the air between us, beautiful and painful and real. He needed me. It was the one thing I had longed to hear, the one thing I was never sure I would. I closed the final few feet between us and gently wiped the tear from his cheek with my thumb. You don't have to be lost by yourself, I said quietly. You don't have to figure this all out today. We can just start here. With this. With the truth. He leaned into my touch, his eyes closing. I don't know how, he whispered. I don't know how to do this. Neither do I admitted. But we can learn together. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to be willing to stop running. He opened his eyes, and in them, I saw a flicker of something new. Not just fear, but determination. A choice being made. He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. Okay, he said, the word holding the same weight it had in the darkroom. A promise. A beginning. I'm done running. He didn't stay at my apartment that night. We both knew it was too soon, that we needed to reset, to start this new chapter on a foundation of intention, not just comfortable habit. He needed to be in his own space, to confront the ghosts of the life he was leaving behind. But this time, the silence was different. It wasn't a void. It was a space for breathing. He texted me before he went to bed. Good night, Leo. Thank you. And I texted back, good night, Caleb. You're not alone. The days that followed were a slow, careful dance of rediscovery. We were not just friends anymore, but we were not yet comfortable in the shape of something more. We were architects designing a new structure without a blueprint. We went on dates, a concept that felt both thrilling and absurd after a decade of friendship. We went for dinner at a place neither of us had been before. We walked through the park, and for the first time, he reached for my hand, his fingers lacing through mine without hesitation, a public declaration that was both terrifying and exhilarating. We talked. We really talked, not just about our days, but about our fears, our hopes, about the difficult conversation he knew he would one day have to have with his parents. I listened, and I held his hand, and I didn't offer easy solutions. I just offered my presence. He started to dismantle the museum of his old life. He packed up Sarah's things, with a quiet sadness but also a sense of release. He bought a new couch, one that he picked out himself. He started to fill the empty walls of his condo with prints of my photographs, turning the sterile space into something that reflected him, the real him that was slowly emerging. And he started spending nights at my apartment again, but it was different now. It was a choice, a joyful decision, not a desperate retreat. There was no more ambiguity. When we got into my bed, it was not just for comfort, but for intimacy. The touches were no longer hesitant or questioning. They were confident and loving and sure. One rainy Sunday morning, months later, we were lying in bed, the gray light filtering through the blinds. He was tracing patterns on my arm, his touch gentle and familiar. The peace in the room was a palpable thing, a quiet, steady hum. My apartment had never felt more like a home. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice a low rumble against my chest. I smiled. "I was just thinking about the first night you stayed here. On the couch." How terrified I was, he lifted his head to look at me, a soft, apologetic look in his eyes. "I'm sorry for all the confusion, for putting you through all that. I was such a mess. You were grieving," I said, running my fingers through his hair. "And you were finding your way." "We both were." He settled back down, his head resting on my shoulder. "I had this dream the other night," he said quietly. "I was in my dad's church, and it was empty. I was standing at the pulpit, and I was supposed to give a sermon, but I had no words. And I was terrified. Then, I looked out, and in the very back pew, you were there. You were just sitting there, with your camera. And you smiled at me. And suddenly, I knew what to say. What was it?" I asked, my throat tight. "I just said, 'Be still, and know that's it.' That was the whole sermon." He went quiet for a moment. "It's what I feel when I'm with you. A stillness, a knowing that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be in that moment. All the years of quiet longing, all the months of anxious uncertainty, all the fear and the pain of the aftermath, it all coalesced into a single, profound feeling of peace. The journey had been tumultuous, a slow, painful development process in the dark. But the image that had emerged was clearer, more beautiful, and more true than anything I could have ever hoped for. Later that day, as I was making coffee, he came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder. He was looking at the bedroom door, which I had left open, as I always did. He reached out one hand and gently pushed it closed, the soft click of the latch echoing in the quiet apartment. It was no longer a boundary to be defended or a barrier to be negotiated. It was just a door. And on the inside, together, we were home. We had learned that the safest harbors are not places you find, but spaces you build together, out of trust and vulnerability and the quiet courage to say what is true. And we began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had finally learned to create.